As you know, in 2001, a group primarily made up of Seattle-based businessmen came together to establish the Basketball Club of Seattle. The ultimate goal has been and continues to be to preserve the future of professional basketball here in the Northwest region, and to do it in a way that I think reaffirms our commitment to our fans. Today, although this is extremely difficult and for me personally disappointing, I'm really proud to be able to announce that after careful analysis of all the possible scenarios, the Basketball Club of Seattle has entered into an agreement with the Professional Basketball Club, LLC, to purchase the Seattle SuperSonics and the Seattle Storm.
It is our desire to have the Sonics and Storm remain in Seattle. Sonics, Storm, and Seattle are synonymous, and we have great respect for history. If a commitment for a new building is not realized, then we will evaluate our options, which will include relocation.
The Sonics have a valid lease with the City of Seattle through 2010, and we intend to enforce that lease.
We've got a place, and we've got the people, and we've got a much better city in which to play basketball.
Senator Gorton and the mayor are determined to exact whatever pound of flesh is possible here, and they will, and then the team will leave.
This is about us. This is about Seattle. This is about making sure that the NBA and the nation know that they can't come in and just take something from us and think we're going to lie down.
Save our sons! Save our sons! Save our sons! Save our sons!
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, buckle up, friends. It's going to be an interesting conversation for sure. Hi there. My name is Tim Hanlon, and you have found Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to each and every week, if you can believe it, what used to be in professional sports. And what a clip that is. And it is from a movie that came out about 10 years ago. It's called Sonicsgate. And if you haven't seen it, drop what you're doing, stop this podcast, and immediately either go to YouTube or go to our link at goodseatsstillavailable.com, search up this episode, and click the link into Amazon Prime and watch it all the way through. It is an amazing story put together by our guests this week, Jason Reid and Adam Brown, filmmakers and documentarians, out of Seattle, about the story of the Seattle SuperSonics, the team that absconded, left in a very messy divorce kind of way back about a decade ago, and is newly interesting to lots of people, especially with one of the main characters in that saga, a guy named Howard Schultz, who is getting ready to run supposedly as an independent candidate for president in 2020. And most people may not remember that Howard Schultz was part of the ownership saga that was the Seattle SuperSonics. He and his group of investors own the team. They purchased the team from the second ever owner of the Sonics, Barry Ackerley, back in 2001, and in relatively short order, demanded and tried his best. Some would put best in quotes to get a more suitable arena for the Seattle SuperSonics team. And this against the backdrop in the early 2000s of a league, the NBA, and sports in general, sort of ascending to stratospheric levels in terms of new facilities and desirous of new revenue streams beyond ticket sales and the like. And it is a story, a sad one in many respects for Seattle basketball fans. You have to remember that this team, the Seattle SuperSonics, was Seattle's first ever professional sports franchise. Started in 1968, even a year before the Seattle Pilots that we've talked about. And, it is a team rich in history, won an NBA championship in the late 70s. In essence, it was, quite beloved by the city of Seattle. My mistake. I'm sorry, 1967 is when the team came into being. All the more reason, frankly, for why the demise of the team and its a departure to what is now the Oklahoma City Thunder was that more dramatic and more sad, frankly. And it's a story rich in intrigue, in political battles, and frankly hubris. Not just by the way of Howard Schultz, but you've got some very interesting characters in here that we're going to get into with our guests this week. Jason Reid and Adam Brown, they the filmmakers behind the extraordinary documentary called Sonicsgate. And we're going to get into all of the Seattle SuperSonics history, the messy disentanglements, the leaving for Oklahoma City, as well as perhaps what might be the future of basketball and maybe the Sonics again in Seattle, given all that's happened in the last number of months with the NHL coming back to the Pacific Northwest, et cetera. In our conversation coming up in just a couple of moments, you will not want to miss a moment of it, I assure you. And it's a wonderful conversation. Before we get there, I want to thank all of our great sponsors. But this week, I want to feature our friends at oldschoolshirts.com. That's P.F. Wilson and his team in beautiful downtown Cincinnati, Ohio, home of FC Cincinnati. Congratulations to them and their MLS exploits, and they're well on their way. And hopefully some great stuff to come for them. But oldschoolshirts.com is a great place for high-quality, distressed-looking T-shirts from not only teams and leagues of the past, and by golly, there's all kinds of stuff there in places in sports like hockey and basketball and baseball. You're going to find a lot of great teams and old logos and even leagues memorialized in great classic T-shirt fashion. But interestingly, as we talk about Seattle, you won't find any Seattle SuperSonic stuff there at oldschoolshirts.com. That's messy, it's licensable, it's NBA owned and that kind of stuff. But what you will find there, as well as those other teams, is a great assemblage of T-shirts devoted to all kinds of Seattle history, not only in sports. There's a Seattle Sea Dogs CISL soccer shirt in there. You got Seattle Rainiers shirt in there, but also some really cool stuff like previous and frankly even still existing cool places like Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor and Sunset Bowl. Scroochie's is memorialized in T-shirt fashion there. The old Cellophane Square shirt is there, memorializing that great place where you could buy and sell and trade video and all kinds of stuff. The Kingdome and Six Stadium, they're all there. KYAC, all kinds of radio. There are all kinds of cool cultural trove of treasures there, he says. At oldschoolshirts.com, just click on the Seattle link and you're going to see all kinds of great stuff there at oldschoolshirts.com. And when you go there and you find a shirt that you love, by all means, please use your promo code GOODSEATS, will you? And get 10% off all of your purchases. If you want to find that, you want to get that Fun Forest Seattle Center shirt to fun for the whole family, go for it. It's all there. Frederick and Nelson, Bobo, the pride of Seattle. It's all there, all in the Seattle section of oldschoolshirts.com. And make sure you use that promo code GOODSEATS, and you will get, courtesy of us, 10% off all of your purchases. That's oldschoolshirts.com. And we thank P.F. Wilson and his friends there in Seattle for their sponsorship of the show. And we thank you for listening further for our great conversation with Jason Reid and Adam Brown as we talk about Sonicsgate and the Seattle SuperSonics past and perhaps maybe future in our conversation that we had just a couple of weeks ago. Enjoy. You know, I can't think of a more dramatic and perhaps a little bit more modern story, I guess, relative to all the other conversations and explorations that we found in soccer and basketball and hockey, et cetera, all football, lots of football. Then this Sonics story. And, you know, I remember, when did the movie Sonicsgate originally come out? Because I think I remember watching it on one of the ESPN networks, maybe about, 10 years ago, maybe a little less than that.
It originally came out in 2009 in October. And then that was our free online release. And then at the end of 2011, CNBC hit us up and they wanted to do the North American broadcast rights for it. So we re-edited the film and made it available for TV. It was on CNBC for a year. And then when that deal went up, we signed a 3-year deal with ESPN to have it air on Classic, and they probably aired it like hundreds of times during that time.
All right. Well, so let's go back in time then, because before we sort of get into the Sonics sort of story, and obviously they had quite an interesting and eventful history prior to the bulk of what your movie circles around, which is interesting because, as we'll get to, it's newly relevant in today's modern times. Give us a sense, give our audience a sense of who you guys are, what you guys do for a living, and frankly, why this opus on the Sonics and their messy divorce from the city of Seattle. I gotta think it comes from some initial grounding as being pure fans of the team and or the NBA.
I mean, yeah, we're like lifelong Sonic fans, lifelong citizens of Seattle, living here in the Northwest. And at that time, I was, just getting into filmmaking in my early years. And I just saw what was happening. It was clear as day once Howard Schultz sold to OKC that those guys were going to try to move the team. And I just started recording press conferences and things on the air where everyone was saying that, hey, we're going to try to keep the team there just in case, like they move the team, it'd be like, hey, these guys are lying to us. And when they actually did move the team, obviously we were just totally devastated being like Sonic fans, but that's when Adam and I connected and we decided to make the film Sonicsgate along with a couple of the other guys on our team who were also Sonic fans, and we are all working on film projects and things like that, and it just became a no-brainer. And so we went just kind of crazy over the course of 5 months and just shot and edited the whole thing. And rather than go the normal route of film festivals and trying to get it out for distribution, we literally just released it. We had 2 premieres in Seattle, sold out premieres, and dropped it online and just tried to blow it up as much as possible. And it did kind of go viral. And in the early days of feature-length stuff on the internet for free, it really was, a big success, and ended up winning the Webby Award for Best Sports Film in 2010.
We definitely were rooted as fans first and foremost. We grew up as Sonics fans, and of course we support all the local teams, big Seahawks fans as well. But the Sonics had this sort of lifeblood of Seattle the way that other teams didn't. And, they were the first major team to win a championship in 1979. It really went back generations, and Seattle is a basketball city when you look at all the NBA talent that was produced coming out of the Seattle area, all the current players and players over the decades. So it was really just, it felt like our hearts were ripped out when first we heard that Schultz was going to sell the team to Clay Bennett, who everybody knew was from Oklahoma. And I started volunteering for the Save Our Sonics organization, doing press stuff. I had a journalism background, was pretty young and fresh out of college at the time. And that was when I met Jason at some Save Our Sonics events, and he was just this crazy guy with a camera. And we decided to, after the team left, we just decided, okay, this is too much of a story to not be told properly in documentary form. And we just kind of went nuts from there, along with our our co-conspirators, Colin Baxter, Darren Lund, Colin White are the other core members of the team. And then, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of other people in the community who chipped in with music and resources and photos and contacts. Really the whole community came together behind the project. And that was pretty unique for a film project to sort of galvanize around this team that was here for 41 years, so it was definitely not taken lightly, but we went into it just sort of as fans thinking that the story had to be told, and here we are 10 years later, people are still seeing it for the first time.
So what year around was your collective fandom? I don't know if you guys are the same age, you sound sort of similar, but what years, I guess, did you sort of become sort of Sonics fans? And I'm guessing it was sort of in your childhoods, which tends to be kind of a theme in this show.
Absolutely, yeah. It was our childhoods. We're a few years different. We're very close in age, but so it's the late 80s and early 90s Sonics team. So that was definitely the time when we sort of were, kids watching the NBA for the first time and becoming big Sonics fans. Gary Payton, Sean Kemp, Detlef Schrempf, and, going a little further back than that, X-Man, Xavier McDaniel, and some of the late 80s teams was when I first kind of started being a fan.
Yeah, and I'd say mine was fairly similar. I mean, I remember Tom Chambers back in the 80s, and I was definitely more into, like, baseball and college football back, like, I'd say in the late 80s. But, yeah, once we drafted, like, Gary Payton and Sean Kemp, and once Sean Kemp was in the dunk contest, and we started being, like, in the playoffs, doing well with George Karl as our coach in the 90s. I mean, that's when I turned all my allegiance for all sport to the Sonics. And, even though the team, didn't do as well after those mid-90s Sonics, I still maintained sort of my rabid fandom till the bitter end.
All right, so before we get into this sort of the meat of the matter here, which is what a lot of the documentary focuses on, which is sort of this period of time of the Schultz ownership and then some. I think it's really important. I mean, you kind of alluded to it. I think most people forget. Now, I'm a huge soccer fan, so I remember the Sounders back in the 1970s, but even before, and the Seattle Pilots, which we've done a couple episodes on, 1969. But I think it's lost on a lot of people that the Seattle SuperSonics were the first major professional sports team in the city of Seattle back in 67, right? The October of 67. And
67.
Right. And in Seattle at that time, right, was, it was a relatively large on the West Coast city, probably the biggest city on the West Coast without really a professional major league sports franchise of any sort. So the NBA's movement into Seattle was really almost like the beginning of the opening of some floodgates, so to speak, when it came to recognizing that Seattle could be and would be a fertile place for professional sports via the Sonics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the teams in the 70s too. I mean, when we first had the Mariners, like all growing up, the Seahawks and the Mariners were terrible. I mean, the Mariners had their runs in the early 90s and stuff, but overall, like my memory as being like a little kid was just that those other teams were just terrible. And the Sonics at least had a recent championship, and they, the Sonics were really embraced, especially the championship year with guys like Jack Sikma and Lenny Wilkins and Gus Williams and Downtown Freddie Brown. I mean, they were like loved and embraced by this community, and I think this community had grown to a certain point to deserve an NBA or a professional team. And because I think the Sonics were a success, we pretty quickly thereafter got the Mariners and the Seahawks here. And like you said, the Sounders, one of my early video production gigs was actually like the company I was working for had the rights to all those early Sounders, 70s and 80s Sounders teams when they were playing Pele's New York teams and stuff. And yeah, there's a rich history of sports fans here in this area.
Yeah, it feels to me, though, that Seattle, and having lived in Seattle for a year and a half myself and in a previous life about a decade and a half ago, it still has a sort of a cultural sort of, smallness to it, a sort of a community-esque kind of thing to it. I don't want to call it a small town by any means, but, I would imagine that certainly in the 60s and 70s as this team, basically became kind of the first sort of professional love of this, for this city. right? Really, it was warmly embraced, and almost to the point of it being sort of like Seattle's true home team, and almost like a family kind of a feeling, I guess, to it.
Absolutely. I think, it's hard to put your finger on it, now that the team has been gone for 10 years now, but it really was Seattle's first love in terms of the sports landscape. Now with the Seahawks having won a Super Bowl, that's certainly occupying, that top spot with the Sonics being gone. But man, the Sonics in the 90s in particular, certainly from my memory, it was, the town would stop during the playoffs. That's all anyone would talk about. And, just having those games, Seattle it's a rainy city during those long winter months, and you don't have a whole lot to do outside. And so you'd look forward to that Tuesday night game or just any regular season game. It really brought the whole city together. And it really, we miss it to this day. Jason and I are still huge NBA fans. We watch as many games as we can. We have a huge 14-team fantasy league. We're still just NBA junkies, and that comes from growing up in that era and the Sonics just being part of our souls growing up. If you'd asked me when I was 13 years old what I was going to do when I grew up, I would say I'm going to play in the NBA and I'm going to play for the Sonics. So, delusions aside, that was just like what the city, was as much as part of the city as Kurt Cobain or Jimi Hendrix or, any of the other cultural institutions that you think of with Seattle. Coffee, technology, computers, all these things. And the Sonics were right there. We hear all the time, having done a lot of these interviews with people worldwide, people in Italy that say, oh, Seattle, Kurt Cobain and Gary Payton. Or, is the first thing that people say is the Sonics, and you still see people wearing the jerseys everywhere you go. And, it's pretty amazing that despite the way the team was unceremoniously ripped away from us, that still sticks with us, and you still just have that as part of the culture here, almost as if the team is still in Seattle. So we're pretty optimistic. Well, I know we'll get into the sort of modern era and politics questions, but we're optimistic that the soul of Seattle basketball is still here, and everyone here is still fighting to bring a team back.
So I was actually I was actually living in Seattle during the 95-96 season, which ironically was the franchise's ever best. I think they won 64 games that year and went all the way to the finals that year against the Bulls. I went to a couple of games at the Key Arena, and I was impressed by how intimate that arena was, large but not so large, right? And also was my first taste of hearing the dulcet tones of Kevin Calabro calling the games on the radio as well. So it was really it really got a sort of special feel that this was sort of truly Seattle's hometown team. But let's get into sort of the prelude, shall we say, of what we're going to talk about, which is the Howard Schultz ownership, which came in the aughts. But maybe you can kind of set the scene for our audience a little bit as sort of give us a sense of the team, around that sort of mid to late 1990s. Obviously a pretty successful run, almost matching some of the highest successes of the late 70s when the Sonics had won their first championship. Clearly riding on a high in the mid to late 1990s, but it kind of sort of went in a ditch pretty shortly thereafter, right?
It was an interesting, we refer to it as the perfect storm in the movie, in that there was a lot of circumstances that had to come together for this team to leave Seattle after 41 years and all the success that they had. So in the 90s, if you look at NBA playoff records and win-loss records, the Sonics were one of the best teams in the NBA all the way through the 90s. And then in the late 90s, they had traded Sean Kemp. Vin Baker was not quite the player that, you needed to anchor a contending championship team. The NBA went through some interesting changes in terms of its business model. You had the strike-shortened season of 1999 with the lockout. And a lot of people sort of view that, as a bit of a downtime in the NBA, the late 90s, early 2000s, while they were figuring out the new collective bargaining agreement. Howard Schultz bought the team, and there was a lot of optimism around that because he was, a big Starbucks guy with a lot of resources. And so people thought that would revitalize the team and inject a little more, resources and just the ability to get good free agents. He was talking a big game about 5-year plan to win a championship. And, so there was a lot of optimism there. But it was also a time where the NBA started sort of struggling financially. And a lot of these arenas that got it done in the 90s were starting to become obsolete with the new NBA business model that relied increasingly on not only ticket sales and TV revenue, but sort of like restaurants and non-basketball revenue. So Key Arena was built in 1995, same year as the Chicago's United Center, and Key Arena was basically obsolete, within a couple years. If you look at the next wave of NBA arenas that were built with double the square footage, which meant more restaurants, more ways to generate revenue outside of ticket sales. So that combined with the fact that the Key Arena lease was a backloaded lease, meaning that the team's obligations to pay the city increased as the lease went on. The team also, was selling out games all through the 90s, but as they became less competitive, ticket prices, it was no longer a sellout every single game. And so there was a lot of, sort of a perfect storm of financial circumstances that led to this sort of downtime where Schultz started saying, I'm losing money, I need a new arena, even though the Key Arena was less than 10 years old at that time. I'm sure Jason has some other insights there too, but that sort of sets the scene of the late 90s.
Well, just the only thing I clarify is, the arena was originally built for the World's Fair in 1962, and it got renovated in 1995, but it was done fairly on the cheap, especially when you're looking at price tags for the other arenas, under $100 million. And so it was a little bit more of a Band-Aid than a full rebuild. And in that meantime, we built CenturyLink Field and Safeco Field, which were each $500 million, and were also kind of heavily contentious taxpayer financed arenas. And there was a lot of backlash. So the Key Arena did get a remodel, and then we built these other two arenas. And so by the time Howard Schultz came back asking for money, it was basically like the state had spent over $1 billion on arenas in the last decade, and they didn't. People were kind of had enough at that point.
Well, that's interesting because that certainly goes back to even dating back to the pilots, right? So, in our previous conversations around that team, with a bunch more to come, I think, there a lot of I think the original promise of the pilots actually starting in '69 was this assumption that there was going to be a new stadium built. And I think that's around the first time where this idea of a dome stadium was actually put into motion, but it kind of veered back and forth and sideways and then some with the political landscape in Seattle. And obviously that dragged on and finally came about in '76 when it opened. And obviously the Mariners came then thereafter. But I get the sense that Seattle and public financed stadia has not necessarily been the easiest of relationships over the years, in which I guess the Sonics and the Key Arena folks found themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and there was also contentiousness with the Key Arena renovation plan, because originally there was talk of putting the basketball arena and having it be NHL ready and having it be next to the Kingdom, which is where currently CenturyLink Field sits. And we couldn't get into this in the movie, not even in the 4-hour cut, and there wasn't a lot of details available. But essentially, the Ackerleys ended up deciding to do it at Key Arena more on the cheap because they couldn't get the deal that they wanted down there. Adam may have more to that story than me, but that's sort of the long story short. And so there's all, and then you look at the last decade since the Sonics left. I mean, we have had battle after political battle here locally to try to figure out a solution that can attract the NBA and the Sonics back to Seattle. And that's just been more more of the same kind of resistance and stuff. So yeah, I would say that's a pretty safe thing to say. But in the meantime, we have funded multiple arenas and have really nice stadiums for basketball and football, for baseball and football.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky thing because people believe that these sports teams are good things and they do bring benefits to the community. But the question is, should public dollars be used to build stadiums? And in the 90s, the answer to that was largely yes. A lot of cities were spending public tax money to build stadiums that then would host the teams and, increase business and revenue for the city and, cultural value and all those things. But this was a booming time in the 90s when the Seahawks and Mariners both got their own new stadiums. And those were very contentious battles. We almost lost before we lost the Sonics. We almost lost the Seahawks and we almost lost the Mariners. Some people and political pundits would have said that those teams were as good as gone before sort of miraculous circumstances came about to rescue them. In the case of the Mariners, it was the miracle 1995 season with Edgar Martinez and Ken Griffey Jr. and Randy Johnson making that improbable playoff run that took the city by storm and ultimately led the politicians to change their mind and approve the new stadium for them. And for the Seahawks, Ken Behring had the team all but moved to California, and they were going to have the moving trucks loaded up, and Paul Allen came in and saved the day there and bought the team and kept them here. R.I.P. Paul Allen, a great man who's contributed a lot to the city. So there was a lot of baggage there in terms of the voter base, and a lot of people felt burned by the public tax burden that went into those other two stadiums. And also the economics changed, when Schultz started asking for more public money, it was not the boom time of the 90s. It was a little more, people were starting to tighten their belts, and it was a different landscape financially. So there were a lot of circumstances that sort of combined there. Also, as we'll get into, Schultz just completely did not play the political game properly. He sort of went expecting a handout from the legislature. When he didn't get it right away, he sort of pouted and took his ball and went home. And, he and David Stern were expecting the legislators to just kiss the ring and give them whatever they wanted. And when that didn't happen, they sort of spitefully used their power to, burn everybody involved, and especially the fans. So, you can't get a stadium approved in one try with a team that's not that competitive. You need to prove that you're here for the long haul. You're going to put a competitive product on the court. You're valuing the public trust and the cultural value of this team to the community. And, Schultz just failed on all those fronts. And it's why, we all view him as public enemy number one in the Sonicsgate saga.
And especially interesting given his political leanings and presidential run. We'll get to that in a minute. But maybe before we get to Schultz specifically, could we maybe just step back one moment and talk about Barry Ackerley, right? He's the owner prior to Schultz, who owned the team mostly through most of the 80s and certainly all of the 90s. Any little background anecdote or story about Ackerley and perhaps maybe leading up to why he looked to sell, and ultimately successfully so, the team to Schultz in the first place in 2001?
Barry Ackerley, I think, was kind of like a player's owner in the sense that, like Gary Payton would refer to him as like family. It wasn't like a owner-player relationship as much as it was like kind of a family or a team or whatever. And he was a guy who made his money, like he had billboards around town and other sort of local business interests. He wasn't like one of these like billionaire guys, I don't think, but he, was a community guy who had success. And I think he was the second owner of the team after the original owner, Sam Schulman. And I think it's probably one of those things where I think the Key Arena lease is probably part of it. He's like, hey, listen, this is going to we don't have that much money, and Like, I think he honestly felt that selling to Schultz and the basketball club of Seattle, his group of over 50 local owners, I think he felt like it was a safe steward for the team. And I think the timing was probably right for him with his age and stuff to get out. I don't know if he officially ever said exactly why, but I don't think he would have done it I don't think he would have ever sold to like a group of out-of-town investors who would move the team. He specifically sold to a guy like Howard Schultz and a team of local leaders that he believed would keep the team here forever. And so, but yeah, I mean, I know that like Gary Payton in particular speaks of him, very, very fondly. And he, once Howard Schultz got here, Howard Schultz sort of wasn't a player's owner. He was an owner that sort of clashed with the culture of the NBA, and who better to represent the culture of the NBA didn't like than Gary Payton, the ultimate trash talking, like hard nosed basketball player who backed down from nobody and who did have a big ego, and Schultz has a big ego. And that's just that's part of what makes Gary Payton a great athlete, is that he would not back down from anyone on the basketball court. So, but yeah, I think that Barry Ackerley was fairly loved, and I'm sure there's negatives you could say, but not nearly as many negatives as you could say about Howard Schultz and the way he handled his ownership.
Yeah, but Ackerley was kind of ogling for a new arena too, though, right? During his ownership, right? I got the sound like at Bellevue, I know was in play for a while, and it seemed like, and I guess the team was also playing a number of years in the late 70s, early 80s in the Kingdome as well, or instead of Key Arena. So I get the sense that he knew too that this arena, reconstituted or rehabbed or whatever, was not ultimately going to be the place for him to be ultimately successful with the team.
That's what I was saying, though. Like he was trying to build like a brand new arena that was more down in the South End by where the Kingdome was. And I think that he did realize it needed to be sort of a new arena. And when that didn't work out, they put the Band-Aid on Key Arena. And yeah, the lease was not going to get as good. And at the end of the lease, the arena ultimately wasn't fitting what the new model was for the NBA. And he probably just didn't want to fight that battle, And I think Schultz maybe got into it like naively, not even, I'm sure he knew the specifics of the lease and stuff, but I think he probably, just got into it, not worrying about it. And ultimately, both those guys shouldn't have worried about the lease being bad or whatever, because the team's worth $1.3 billion now. And if it was in Seattle instead of Oklahoma City, it'd probably be worth closer to $2 billion. So, like it can lose money at the time, but it still is increasing in valuation over time. So.
Yeah, my sense is he was also interested in possibly, trying to attract an NHL team as well, which is ironic, of course, and we'll get into. Well, so why do you think he ultimately, Ackerley, sold the team in 2001? Like, what was sort of going on specifically then? Had he had just enough, or was he getting older? Was it, was his family not interested in carrying on? What were the motivations that you could tell? Maybe he just saw the valuation and he felt it was a good business deal to get out, or other circumstances?
I think that he just saw the writing on the wall. They had this Key Arena lease that was getting worse and worse by the year. You had the NBA business model changing, so it was more reliant on having these big, vast, open, huge square footage arenas to generate additional revenue. There was also just a huge boom in player salaries in the late 90s. And so, the NBA is doing great now in the current collective bargaining agreement, but you couldn't really say that back in the late 90s and early 2000s in terms of the revenue sharing and the ways the TV deals worked. There just weren't as many slices of the pie available. So in my opinion, Ackerley just saw the writing on the wall and saw, hey, we're behind the eight ball here. There's no support for, public funding of a brand new arena. We got this Key Arena deal, which, Key Arena is a beautiful place to watch a basketball game, but it just didn't have all those additional revenue streams. And I think that he just said, rather than do this fight and lobby for a new arena and do all this stuff, I think he just saw that it was time to get out. And certainly, Schultz knew what he was getting into when he bought the team. So there's no real excuse there, in my opinion, as well. You know, he went to the legislature claiming losses of $14 million a year. But, you know, he knew the way that lease was structured, and all he did was poison the well with politicians and make things worse. So, you know, I think Ackerley certainly, you know, if you go back and read, you know, the Seattle Times and Steve Kelly columns and all this stuff, you know, people were critical of the Ackerleys as owners at the time, but sort of in hindsight, you know, we all appreciate them a lot in terms of not only the ways that they, you know, helped the community and were very, you know, positive figures in the community, but also the glory years of the basketball product that they put together. It was one of the most special times in NBA history here watching the Sonics in the 90s. Kevin Calabro, as you mentioned. I mean, it really was just a beautiful time. So I think Ackerley, you know, definitely, like, in hindsight, people appreciated what a good owner he was. And, yeah, like I said, I think he just saw the writing on the wall in the economics and didn't want to fight against politicians anymore.
So let's then get into this Howard Schultz character, okay? Because it seems to me like you're sort of table setting here a bit that, you know, the NBA is sort of in this, you know, leveraging mode into, you know, maybe sort of the smaller owner kind of model and the you know, previous generation of arena into sort of this next level of, you know, let's say billionaire owner and, you know, multiple revenue streams and gigantic sort of playing palaces. And, you know, as a lot of, you know, pro sports in the last 20 or so years has become, right? It's become, you know, mega big bucks and the bigger sort of financial expectations. You know, clearly somebody like Howard Schultz, right? Founder and CEO of a, you know, the probably the biggest food-related company on the planet, maybe next to McDonald's or maybe even surpassing it at this point, you know, seems like the right kind of central casting character, locally owned and grown, so to speak, you know, to sort of exit from stage left to, you know, maybe be that guy in Seattle to take this team to that proverbial next level as the NBA was going. So a little bit about Howard Schultz, why he would be even interested in this, to what you can surmise from what you learned in putting this documentary together.
Well, I mean, I think he, you know, is a guy that does have a big ego, and owning one of these 30 assets that there's only 30 of in the town that you've sort of adopted as your own. Like you said, central casting, it just fit. Like, it fit for him if he was maybe at that time wanting to do something extra. I know his kids are big basketball fans. Maybe he was a big basketball fan, but he saw people at that point. I think at that point, Mark Cuban was kind of on the scene, and it was kind of becoming this, like, I guess, status symbol or whatever. And he, you know, wasn't one of these owners that hid away in the owner's box. He was sitting courtside, like, cheering. He, you know, I think he viewed himself as literally sort of like part of the team. So I think it was like an ego thing, and also just like probably a fun thing for him to do. And he had enough money to do it. And I think also I don't know. I'm not really sure. Adam, do you have something else to chime in on there?
Yeah, I mean, so Howard thought that he could change the culture of the NBA. He had so much success with Starbucks and sort of reinventing the world of coffee and the way, you know, people perceive that. And he had so much success with the brand, and he had become sort of this cult figure hero in that world. And he wanted to be, and he even said, you know, he wanted to bring that success to the NBA and change the culture. So the only problem is that NBA players are not employees in the same way that a barista or, you know, other people who work for Howard might be. So, you know, there were clashes between Howard and members of the team, particularly Gary Payton. And Gary didn't like when people told him what to do. And they had a big public spat in the media over Gary holding out because he wanted a new contract. And Howard, this was sort of typified the sort of culture that Howard wanted to change about the NBA. You know, he didn't like the way that the players were acting and sort of, you know, big money, and, you know, it was a clash of cultures. And Howard thought that he could use his sort of cult leader aspects that were successful in Starbucks and bring that to the NBA locker room. It couldn't have backfired more. So, he very quickly lost Gary Payton, your star player. You're feuding with him in the media. You're feuding with the politicians regarding the lease, saying, I need this lease that I knowingly signed up for is so bad. I need a new lease. I need a restructure. I need a new arena. All this without even really putting a championship contending team on the court. It really just soured so quickly. When Howard first bought the team, he did say all the right things, public trust. I view this as a public trust. I'm going to bring a championship in 5 years. And very quickly he proved that the lessons that he was trying to apply from his success at Starbucks were not working in the NBA, particularly the culture of the players that he was trying to mold and did not want to be molded in his image. So it was pretty brutal, and things turned sour very fast and became toxic, within the first couple years of Howard owning the team.
All right, we're going to take a quick, brief pause, and we want to remind you that our friends at Audible are offering to you, our listeners, an opportunity to get a free audiobook download from their amazing array of over 190,000 titles to choose from. When you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats, and that's the place to go to get your free audiobook download, courtesy of us and Audible. And it's something you can cancel at any time, and you can keep the book for as long as your device exists. And like I said before, there's just a ton of choices available to you to burn up that free credit, including a bunch in the realm of our forgotten sports little genre here, including in the realm of basketball. If you fancy yourself a fan of the old ABA, for example, 2 great books on the great Julius Erving that might be worth using your credit for. One, of course, is the Rise and Rise of Julius Erving. It's called Doc, and it's written by Vincent Milazzi and narrated by David Cromet. You could use your credit for that book, and it's a great sort of interview style background on the life and times of Dr. J from all sides. But if that's not good enough for you, why not try the autobiography? It's called Dr. J, the Autobiography, of course. It's written by Dr. J in concert with Carl Greenfeld, and it's narrated by Dr. J himself, Julius Erving, and you could use your credit for that book, as well as, like I said, thousands and thousands of other books, not just only in basketball and basketball history, but in a whole host of genres and topics. By all means, give them a try. Why don't you? It's risk-free, for God's sakes. audibletrial.com/goodseats. Yes, audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's the link. And that's where you're going to get your free audiobook download. Again, you can cancel at any time. And once you do download that book for free, and after you cancel it, if you choose to do that, it's yours to keep. So you can enjoy in perpetuity, for as long as your device lives, the downloaded book free and gratis, courtesy of yours truly here at Good Seats Still Available and our friends at Audible. Thank you, Audible. We appreciate it. And we appreciate you joining our conversation once again. Give me a sense of what those years were like. I mean, obviously the Gary Payton thing was a huge PR and probably just divisive within the team, a fiasco, frankly. Obviously the team was relatively mediocre. It certainly had its blip in 2005, perhaps a little too late in terms of competitiveness on an ongoing basis. But what do you think it was about Schultz and his management? I mean, was it a lack of understanding about what kind of talent was needed? Was it naivete about this arena situation? I mean, I can't imagine he would be completely naive given some of the moves and the machinations that Akron at least had gone through with that recognition of the key arena and perhaps its limitations going forward. I mean, what specifically that you can recall or from what you learned in putting this documentary together, what were some of the pieces that sort of just made it toxic so quickly both on and off the court.
Well, I think he thought that he could work through the arena stuff. He's like, oh, okay, well, I'm a skilled negotiator or whatever. I can work through this stuff in the same way that Adam was saying. He thought he could come in and inspire these guys to act like his baristas and kind of, adopt his culture. I mean, I do think part of the problem was personnel for sure. I mean, you traded Gary Payton, and it was nice because we got Ray Allen back, and Ray Allen was like an absolute joy to sort of watch as a player, but they never, Rashard Lewis was our other sort of big name guy who wasn't ever really that good. And they kept trying to find the center, and they drafted a lot of, and I don't know if this is specifically, but they drafted a lot of sort of nice guy. We used to have like a lot of tough, hard-nosed guys, but we drafted Nick Collison, Luke Ridnour, who are good players and stuff, solid fundamental guys like what Howard Schultz wanted, but they weren't going after the talent, the 2 to 3 big name superstars to make us truly competitive. And, and I think that as the team started losing money on paper, like Adam was saying, $14 million a year, it gave them more of a justification to not have a luxury tax and not pick up, these big name guys. So our team was sort of mediocre, and that 2004-2005 season was awesome. I know, like, we all loved watching that, and we far exceeded expectations going to the semifinals and taking San Antonio to 6 games, but it wasn't really like sustainable. And that was right when things were heating up with Schultz getting into various feuds with both the state legislature and the city government, both the mayor and the city council. So he was kind of like, feuding with everyone, and he came in sort of on his high horse. And I think he expected that, you guys should realize I'm losing money every year on this, so you should help do something for me because I'm doing this as a public trust. And so if you don't do that, though, I may have to sell the team. Meanwhile, Howard Schultz has plenty of money, like, to be able to handle those losses or whatever. But, I mean, I don't know. So there was a lot of different avenues going on. There was the player feuding, there was the government feuding, there was the overall just like lack of being able to build a winning team.
So if I have this right, the Key Arena was it was remodeled in 95 or so, and at the time, I guess, was then the smallest venue in the NBA. It was like 17,000 or so, right? And it's my understanding that Schultz is one of his first most immediate, well, maybe it wasn't immediate, or maybe it took him a season of operations to kind of sort of get to this, was this idea of working towards expanding Key Arena. That was sort of the goal, right? It wasn't another stadium somewhere else, from what I can tell. But it almost feels like that was sort of his linchpin for ongoing success, was to get basically some form of new arena, in this case, a more modernized, even since 95, expansion of Key Arena. Is that right?
A more extensive remodel, So I think he was proposing $218 million, $200 million of which the government would pay for, and $18 million which would be a private contribution. And by the time he'd sold the team to Bennett, and Bennett was exploring the Renton option, the price for that same or similar remodel had gone up to $300 million. And now you look at what's going on at Key Arena, they're spending $800+ million on a remodel now. So, which is happening.
Yeah, it definitely, Schultz wanted that remodel, but he wasn't willing to pay for it. That really shows how the people's perspectives on the public funding have changed. Now people aren't even willing to entertain any public money going towards it. But this, Sonicsgate really did mark sort of a shift in what people's attitudes were towards that. And, Steve Ballmer came in and tried to save the team and tried to buy it from Clay Bennett, who wasn't willing to sell, but Ballmer was going to put up $150 million out of a $300 million remodel, which at the time was seen as just a mind-blowingly good deal, a 50-50 public-private partnership. And so now here we are 10 years later, and basically it has to be all private to even fly. So I think, people's attitude towards public money has changed, and Schultz just wanted that handout. He really thought that he deserved this. And how could you not, give me what I'm asking for right away. And it really became personal very fast between Howard Schultz and Frank Chop, the Speaker of the House, who sort of controlled, the party leadership on that issue at the legislature.
What was the animus, though? Was there personal animus towards Schultz? Was it Schultz's style? I think you alluded to maybe some of that being the case. Was it a mixture of the two, or was it largely Schultz's, indifference, or not indifference, his intransigence?
Yeah, I think it was all of those things. I mean, you got to keep in mind there was a lot of baggage from the Seahawks and Mariners stadium deals, which people were just fresh, fed up with that. And even though everyone's happy with those buildings and happy to have those teams here, ultimately the public voted against those deals and didn't want, about 50% of the public didn't want those deals to happen. So as the economic downturn happened, after that, in the early 2000s, the city of Seattle passed a measure called I-91, which simply stated any public money that goes into sports arenas must get an equal return in value back, which basically meant that all of those deals that the prior deals of 90% public money, 10% private were not going to fly, and that sort of the bare minimum was this Steve Ballmer 150 million 50-50 deal. So so it was that baggage from the previous stadiums, and you also had Schultz's attitude. He came in as sort of this big shot. Right away, you see it today in his political campaigning, this sort of like squirmy, uncomfortable, how dare you criticize me, how dare you ask me that, I'm the American dream, I am the cult leader, you need to buy into my cult. He sort of just had this attitude like, you need to get on my train or get the hell out. So people did not like that, and we have some of those clips of him at the legislature talking about we're on a collision course with time, and crying foul because he was losing $14 million a year, even though the team value was going up every year, and he ultimately sold for a big profit. So it was just seen as very disingenuous, and people had no tolerance for it in the wake of the other two stadium deals.
That's interesting. Okay, so at what point then in this 5-year ownership odyssey of his does the notion privately and publicly of selling the team come about? Because it seems like he talked to lots of entities. I'm just wondering how quickly that surfaced after his purchase of the team, and how quickly that might have gotten out into the. I can't imagine it wasn't a secret for too long that he was talking to groups from places like Las Vegas and Kansas City and Anaheim and San Jose and Vegas and apparently other places, then Oklahoma City eventually.
It was rumored, but it was basically overnight. Is that what you're going to say, Reid, sir? Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, it was really out of nowhere. There was, semi-veiled threats from both Stern and Schultz that, hey, just so you know, we may have to consider that we don't want to have to do that, but we are on a collision course with time, and we may have to consider other options if we can't get what we need. But it was never like, we're going to move the team away or we're going to sell the team to out-of-town investors. It was more like, some vague threats. But, really no one was anticipating a sale when it happened. He wasn't publicly out soliciting investors. There were super, super small little leaks of things, but nothing that warranted. And there wasn't really social media like it is now in terms of spreading those kind of rumors as quickly. So
yeah, it was pretty much overnight. I mean, there were rumors that might be happening, but basically when Schultz called the press conference to announce that he was selling the team, they had all these balloons at the team facility. If you ask local media, it was the most disingenuous, disgusting farce they've ever been a part of. They came, showed up to the press conference. It looked like a celebration with all these balloons and everything, and everyone just knew that as soon as Clay Bennett was announced as the recipient of the team, that spelled almost sure doom for the Sonics in Seattle. So it basically was announced overnight, and he pulled the rug out. That's why people say that he took his ball and went home, and just he wasn't willing to stick it out. The Sonics had 2 more years on the lease. He had 2 more years to figure out how to make this deal work with the legislature and go play politics and go do the things that you need to do to be successful in that realm. And he just had no patience for it, didn't get what he wanted right away, and basically sold the team away in the dead of night. There was no public announcement like, hey, I'm going to sell the team and listen to local buyers. There was only the announcement that the team has been sold. And, there were other rumored buyers. One of the rumors is that Steve Ballmer came out and wasn't willing to pay as much as Bennett. One of the other rumors was that Larry Ellison was going to buy the team, but was guaranteed to move it to San Jose. But those are just rumors. We don't have substantiating facts for that. And so what we do know is that, what Schultz is on the record as doing and saying, and it's pretty damning in terms of his integrity.
All right, I want to get to Bennett in a second, but you did mention a name that I really want to get your perspective on, because he does appear quite a bit in this film and in this story. That's David Stern, right, the former commissioner of the NBA. What I don't know as a not being immediately involved in the story is how much or how little is David Stern and the NBA and the owners of such involved in, I don't want to say pulling the strings around this story, but it seems to me that Stern and, well, you tell me, I mean, where was the league and Stern in particular around about this situation? What was their take and their desire, frankly, for it?
David Stern is certainly culpable. Everyone in Seattle will boo the name David Stern forever. But that's what commissioners are there for. They're there to be a lightning rod and be hated. So I think Sherman Alexie in one of his Sonicsgate interviews that didn't make the cut of the movie said, David Stern, he's an evil, bad guy, but are you going to get mad at a great white shark for taking a bite out of your leg when you're swimming in the ocean? That's his job. So, David Stern at that time was certainly pushing for all of the teams to get new arenas. And this was just not even a question to him. He said, he would go to the legislature and act very smug and say, we need this new arena to keep this team in this market. And he would leverage various teams against each other. And Seattle, since the team has left, has become the #1 leverage city to get new arenas in Sacramento, Milwaukee, Indiana, all with threats to potentially move to Seattle if they didn't, play ball and build a new arena there. You also have to work in the factor of Hurricane Katrina had displaced the New Orleans Hornets at that time, and they played a season and a half in Oklahoma City while the stadium was being, refurbished, and they were in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So Clay Bennett had sort of done David Stern a few solids, by hosting that team, and it was sort of a test market for them. You also had a relationship that goes back to Bennett's being a minority owner of the San Antonio Spurs, and having some good relationship with David Stern from that era. So when it came time to find a credible threat to move the Sonics if they didn't, build the new arena, Clay Bennett was sort of David Stern's perfect, guy to step in and serve that role. So if you look at the emails that are documented in Sonicsgate and came out during the discovery, it shows a very, sort of cuddly relationship between those two. And it comes down to the NBA feeling that this sort of sports industrial complex is valid, that they need public money to build these stadiums, and that's a necessary part of the business model, and that the owner has the right to demand that or threaten to move the team if they don't get it. So Stern is certainly, I don't know how you would rank the villains after Schultz. Schultz is definitely #1. Stern's up there too. And I think, all of Seattle was glad to see him go away and welcomes the sort of fresh, clean slate of Adam Silver as commissioner, who seems to be a little more in tune to sort of the heartbeat of the fan base of the NBA. And so we're a little more hopeful now that Adam Silver will, grant Seattle a team now that we have the Key Arena remodel officially approved with private funding, as well as another group down here in Soto that's trying to build a stadium as well. So that's sort of a roundabout way to answer the question. But yes, David Stern is a bad guy in all this, and we're not going to let him forget it.
So describe the Clay Bennett situation then. So upon his announcement, it's interesting, by the way, too, parenthetically, I'm surprised, maybe not, that I wonder how much Kansas City was in the mix, right? Because that was around the time that the Sprint Center was basically being built. And I think on the bet that either an NHL or an NBA or both teams would come there. And ironically, it's a facility that still sits bereft of a major league franchise in Kansas City. But so Bennett, clearly that's an interesting part of the dynamic here, where that the New Orleans piece, the doing Stern a solid, so to speak, and in keeping the Hornets sort of domiciled for a little while. But it almost feels, maybe in hindsight, it was almost a fait accompli, that the wheels were maybe kind of geared in Bennett's favor, maybe from the outset, once it was known that Schultz wanted to sell.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Bennett, and particularly Aubrey McClendon and some of the other owners had it in their heads that they were going to do this move the whole time, and Howard Schultz, as a part of the sale, included this good faith best efforts that they will make for a year to keep the team in Seattle. And so Bennett came in, if you go back to the press conference Adam's referring to and watch it in full, I mean, Bennett's saying, I'm here to preserve the history of basketball in the Northwest, and I'm going to do everything I can to get an arena done here. And Howard Schultz, meanwhile, is saying, hey, I felt like having this credible threat to move the team was the only way that would force the legislature and the government to act on this. Meanwhile, it just alienated everyone, including the government, particularly when you had Bennett come in, and rather than choose an arena like in Soto or within the city limits, he did this extensive research and decided that Renton, which is, 20 minutes south of the city of Seattle without traffic, was where he wanted to build the arena, one of the worst traffic interchanges in the entire region. And he wanted $500 million, and he said he might put up to $100 million into, or $500 million, and he might put up to $100 million in it, meaning that the legislature wasn't being asked for $100 million, it wasn't $200 million, it was another nearly $500 million that was being asked for. And so he came in pretty disingenuously. I mean, he hired the architects, he hired the PR firms to draft up fancy proposals to go, and he went to Olympia and he pitched government, but it was a non-starter because the plan wasn't realistic and he wasn't offering any money officially. And so, he was just kind of trying to come in and swindle our community out of the team as quickly as possible, while on the surface fulfilling his obligation in the contract about making a good faith best efforts. But what happened was, once the city of Seattle sued the professional basketball club, which was Clay Bennett's company, there was an email discovery phase. And in those email discovery phases, Aubrey McClendon and some of the other owners talked about, moving the team, wanting to move the team to Seattle, which, revealed, a lot about what was going on behind the scenes. And, David Stern was working with Clay Bennett to get this done, which was actually the polar opposite of how he handled the Sacramento Kings situation a couple years later, where he did everything in his power to try to keep the Kings in Sacramento. And I think a big part of that was his reputation and not wanting to have two very storied franchises moving at the end of his tenure in the NBA, and the Seattle thing became a pretty big black eye. But anyhow, Clay Bennett bold-faced lied and deceived our community, and took the team away at the first opportunity he could.
Yeah, and it was really obvious to anyone who could see what was going on at that time. When it came to the moves they were making, they were not giving players, making them accessible for radio interviews. we drafted Kevin Durant right before that last season. Seattle's only rookie of the year for the Sonics was Kevin Durant. Everyone knew Kevin Durant was a once-in-a-lifetime player at that time, and could see that he was a future star in the making, and he would be a generational talent. And, of course, what do right after drafting Kevin Durant? They trade away Ray Allen for peanuts to the Boston Celtics, for future draft picks. They basically tanked and decided to rebuild in Seattle those last couple years so that they could have a better slate in Oklahoma City with a bunch of high draft picks, and also alienate the Seattle fan base intentionally. Kevin Calabro, the greatest announcer in the history of basketball, in my opinion, says that the players were restricted from coming on the air, and you could just see that there was no interest in building something in the Seattle community from the OKC ownership group. The only interest they had was tearing it down, making it the worst team possible, which they were the last year, a 20-62 record, despite having, Kevin Durant Rookie of the Year. The players that they brought in were just laughable. Late stage career, Wally Serbiak was the highest scoring player other than Kevin Durant on the team. You just had, such an obvious tanking that was happening here in Seattle to alienate the fan base. And, those draft picks ended up becoming Russell Westbrook and Serge Ibaka, and, players that Oklahoma City sort of rode their glory once they moved the team. So it was just disgusting. They did all kinds of other underhanded moves. They moved the radio broadcast, which you could always hear on 950 KJR here, was a staple of Sonics basketball. They moved the radio broadcast to this right-wing conservative radio station, which not a lot of ears tune into here in liberal Seattle. And it was just really obvious that they were doing everything they could to tank the team in Seattle and move it to Oklahoma City, which was, of course, proven by the email discovery during the court case.
All right, so I don't want to go through the court case here because it's obviously a long and winding thing. And by the way, the movie goes into almost exquisite background and detail on sort of the craziness sort of around that. But give me a sense of the fans in all of this, right? And you mentioned or alluded to the Save Our Sonics and Storm group, the SOS group that sort of came about. I mean, it sounds to me like the fans kind of were pretty quick and pressed too to kind of read between the lines and see through what arguably had become kind of a tanking effort for this arguably ordained eventual move to Oklahoma City. Were the fans like outraged or were they kind of just resigned to this being played, so to speak? Or what was sort of the mindset in 06-07 as this team was effectively in slow motion?
If you listen to the words coming out of Clay Bennett's mouth, he's saying everything he's saying. If you're reading the words, is he's going to do everything he can to make basketball successful here in Seattle. So if you want to just sort of naively believe people at their word, there were some people that said, okay, yeah, it's kind of weird. It's a group of Oklahoma businessmen, but why would they move to Oklahoma? This is a much better market, trying to justify it or whatever. Then you had a lot of people that were just like, that was the worst day ever. And, sports radio people and a lot of other people that are like, there's no way they're keeping the team here. There's not a chance they're keeping the team here. And I remember I went to the first SOS meeting, which was outside of a Storm game, within days of, sometime within days or a week of the sale. And it was kind of like, all right, well, he says he wants to get a team done. We'll support him in doing that. The moment that he's not doing that, then we're going to fiercely oppose it, but we're going to make sure our voices are heard that we want the team to stay in Seattle, and we'll make that clear at any time. And, Clay Bennett had Lenny Wilkins, the Sonic great, with him campaigning down in Olympia for his arena deal. Like, everybody wanted to try to get a deal done. And I do think there's like a small percentage that, well, Clay Bennett, if we would have bent over backwards and built the $500 million stadium, he would have legally had to stay here. And that was his bet. It's like, okay, well, if we get a new arena built, we can do the sweet flip, as they referred to it in their email, which was to just like turn it for a nice profit, and then they could maybe buy another team or get an expansion team or whatever it is if they aren't able to move the team. So, and it would have been a good business move for them too. But anyhow, I mean, that's the sort of mood of the fans was mostly like very skeptical and very like unsure of what was going to happen. And then, like Adam said, once they started trading away, once they just started completely tanking and making it very, very, very clear that they weren't interested in fielding a like competitive team in the years left in Seattle, like it was pretty obvious that they were going to move the team as soon as they could.
But the crux of the matter though was leaving their lease, which was I think through 2010, right, a few years early, and that was sort of the acute reason for the lawsuit to.
Yep, that was the lawsuit. The city of Seattle sued. Clay Bennett basically said, "Hey, this is not situated. We're losing too much money. We can't afford to stay here. We have a deal in Oklahoma City where we want to go there. We want to break the lease because this is kind of like a divorced situation." And the city of Seattle said, "No, you actually have a couple more years on the lease. We believe in those couple of years we can figure out a way to get an arena deal done. So we're going to hold you to that lease." And they played the hard line stance. Our mayor at the time, Greg Nichols, said, that over and over again, our intention is to hold you to the lease. We plan to hold you to the lease. They went through the whole trial proving that they should be held to the lease, only to like in the last hour make a settlement agreement that allowed the team to leave. And I think that the NBA and Clay Bennett and everyone threatened that the NBA will never come back if they allow the judge to rule in favor of the city of Seattle and hold them to the lease. And meanwhile, if we would have had Kevin Durant here for 2 years, it would have become Ken Griffey Jr. refused to lose in the 90s. And like the team, going to the playoffs, us drafting Russell Westbrook and then James Harden and realizing we have this team. Well, the team, would have been saved. Ballmer and Jim Senegal, the founder of Costco, and John Stanton had already come through with wanting to, do this arena plan to save the team and keep him in Seattle. And obviously Ballmer did want to buy a team, and you give him a couple more years, he might have been able to orchestrate things to be able to do that at that time. So it's just a total missed opportunity to not holding them to the lease, because that last couple of years could have made all the difference in keeping the team versus leaving, which is another reason like Greg Nichols could have been a hero, and instead he completely, bent it over backwards and, blew it. I mean, he just completely signed a terrible deal for the city and was the final straw that allowed the team to leave.
All right. So tell me then about this. We'll sort of near the rounding of the corner here, as I want to keep you all evening because the movie itself, as long as it is fascinating, and if you haven't seen it, it is must viewing. We'll get into where and when you can sort of continue to see that to get all the sort of the fireworks of this. But what I find just amazing as this case is unwinding, it almost feels like sort of a march towards a settlement of some sort, where maybe perhaps the city of Seattle could get some kind of guarantee of a replacement franchise at some point down the road and that kind of stuff. Along comes Howard Schultz with his own lawsuit after the fact, claiming duplicity, I guess, from Bennett and his friends. But perhaps you can tell us why this lawsuit from Schultz, almost seemingly wanting maybe to regain some kind of moral stature in all of this. But I don't think this suit doesn't happen without the release of some emails during the course of the case itself. Can you unwind this little side story? Because it's a very interesting coda, I guess, on the messy divorce that was proceeding.
The Schultz lawsuit actually had a ton of legs, as did the city of Seattle's, in terms of winning. I mean, the side deal that was part of his deal with Clay Bennett was this good faith, best efforts clause. And, the emails, in the email discovery of the lawsuit in the city of Seattle, it was proven via the emails that they did not make good faith best efforts. Actually, they were meanwhile negotiating with Oklahoma City and the arena down there on scheduling stuff for the next year. They were, talking about they were scheming on how to get out of the deal. And so I actually think Howard Schultz's lawsuit, I think a lot of it was kind of like to save face, and if he would have won and somehow held the team, then he might have redeemed himself. That would have happened. But unfortunately, what happened is, once again, this whole thing, if they would have held the team to 2 years, Howard Schultz's lawsuit would have moved forward. But because the city settled and the team was essentially moving from that point on, Howard Schultz's lawsuit, the most that Howard Schultz's lawsuit would get would be some sort of financial settlement, because the team at that point had already moved. They were already moving the team. The move had been approved by the Board of Governors already, and there was no turning the clocks back. But if they were held to their lease and they had to stay there, and then they had this lawsuit that they were going to lose, then I think the team would have stayed. They could have forced the sale of Bennett to Ballmer or someone else. Schultz didn't want to own the team again, but if his lawsuit prevailed, it could have unwinded the sale or made it so Bennett would have to sell to someone else locally.
So is the interpretation that maybe that Schultz lawsuit at the end there was more of a cynical play when it was basically a fait accompli and things were basically already in motion? Because it looks like the NBA came in to even sort of voice their opinion that, if the Schultz lawsuit sort of went on, it would destabilize the franchise and would interfere with, the process that's already in place and it was already too late, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, if they voted to move the team, but if the judge would have ruled to keep the team there, then the team, that would have offset that vote to move the team, because they wouldn't actually have the ability to move the team for a few more years. And that would have, Schultz could have just kept his lawsuit going, and the emails were already proven. So it would have taken Bennett to court. And at some point, a local owner would have emerged. It probably would have been Ballmer, but it could have been someone else. And I think at that point, Bennett would probably, rather than deal with the lawsuit and everything, want to sell the team, because he was in the wrong. He was going to lose the court case, and it would be a big messy thing. And he could probably even make a profit on the deal at that point, especially with Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook as his guys,
So I guess where I'm just trying to come out in all of this is, and I think this sort of will sort of lead to our denouement here as a conversation, right, is Howard Schultz, obviously, quite the villain, certainly in the beginning part of this conversation. But what I'm trying to ascertain is whether, do you think he was truly duped in all this and sort of, his incredulity and doing this sort of lawsuit near the end of all of this this stuff, or do you think he kind of knew what he was getting out of, and he's not really sort of an angel in all of this at the end of the day?
I mean, I wouldn't say he got duped. I mean, he's a businessman who's opened up, tens of thousands of stores all over the world. He should be smart enough to recognize, that a group of out of town investors is possibly going to move the team, and that people are going to hate him forever if that happens. I mean, he wasn't that naive. He understands how these things work. So, and I think that he literally got frustrated with the players and the culture of the NBA. He got frustrated with the government. He got frustrated with this big ownership group that he had to keep making capital calls from. He got frustrated with the lease agreement, losing money every year. And he got frustrated with not having a winning team and players that buy into him. And he's a guy who for his whole life has gotten things his way. And when he didn't get his way, he decided to I think the decision was very, very rushed. It showed very little patience and restraint and thought, and you're talking to Wally Walker, who is part of the 9-member board who voted against the sale. It was done very hastily, and he didn't spend time okay, we have this deal. There's no hurry. I can wait a year and just make sure there's no one local. And then once you put the word out and really giving it time, okay, there's really no one local. Okay, everybody, I'm going to sell to these guys, I mean, he didn't do any of that. There was no sort of consulting. It was done, underhanded and in back room and was sold to people that didn't have the best interests of our community in mind. And ultimately, Howard Schultz adopted us as his hometown. He's not a hometown guy, and he betrayed us, and he expects people to still like love him and forgive him here when he couldn't even offer an apology over the last 11 years until the night he launches on Twitter and quasi launches his presidential campaign. And that's when he finally feels like he can say an apology to Sonics fans. I mean, it's just so disingenuous, and he is the biggest villain for us because he's the guy. Without him making that sale, none of this would have happened. We wouldn't be faulting Greg Nichols and Clay Bennett and the NBA. And, we would just, still have a team here because he would have respected the public trust that he, promised at the beginning of his ownership.
All right. So let's put all this sort of in modern current perspective, right? Because it seems like there's an interesting confluence of events that are occurring that make this story almost irrelevant once again, and very tangibly so, right? So number one, you mentioned it, right? Howard Schultz has effectively announced his independent candidacy for presidency of the United States, right? So that's an interesting background, and it's clear that as a public figure or potential public figure, right? This story will not be sort of brushed under the rug, as was evidenced in the Washington Post article from a couple of weeks ago where you guys are quoted and all that stuff. Number two, right, is the arrival of this $500 million franchise fee expansion by the NHL and the Key Arena and its rethinking as being the home of that. I'm just wondering, your Save Our Sonics kinds of efforts, right? Maybe newly boosted by those two things, and maybe you're looking at the success of, say, the Seattle Sounders now, which has really taken over and become a model for Major League Soccer as a franchise. The Seattle Seahawks being very, very successful. Seattle growing by leaps and bounds, lots of wealth from tech. Do we see a return of an NBA franchise in our lifetimes now? And/or what do you make of all these sort of storylines as a potential, backdrop to potentially getting another NBA team in Seattle?
Well, I mean, our whole purpose with Sonicsgate was, of course, to expose the lies and betrayals that led to the team leaving and hold people accountable. But the other main component of that was to motivate people to do what they could to get a team back. And for a lot of years after we released Sonicsgate, there was no tangible path forward because there was no arena plan, and that was what was needed. And now, like you said, we have all the pieces in place. We have a arena that you go by. They are working on the construction on it. It's going to be ready in 2021. And it's just a matter of, I think that we're number one in line to get a team. Yeah, you have Kansas City or whatever, and you have Vegas, who has an arena now. I think Vegas is appealing, but Seattle has the history here. We were really, really wronged, and I think the powers that be in the NBA realize that. And I think there's, like you said, a ton of money and a ton of hardcore fans, and there's there isn't that much crossover between necessarily soccer and basketball. We have tens of thousands of incredibly hungry basketball fans here who are spending their time watching NBA rooting against the Thunder instead of for a team. And I think it's totally primed. I mean, I have confidence. I'm surprised it's taken this long, but we would have had a team had the Sacramento Kings thing not had the ultimate sort of stay of execution combination of craziness that led to them staying. They would have moved here and turned into the Sonics. But ultimately, I'm glad that didn't happen because, we befriended a lot of Kings fans through the process, and we really don't want to take a team, from another market. What should happen is, expansion. But Adam Silver's most recent comments to Bill Simmons, he's talking something like $2.5 billion for an expansion franchise fee because the teams are worth anywhere from $1 to $2 billion each now. And so that's just craziness. I think that Steve Ballmer owning the Clippers and him, feuding with both the Staples Center and the community of Inglewood and the Lakers, in terms of arena stuff down there, I think that's exactly what you do when you're getting a team ready to move them. If you can't, just like Bennett, hey, I don't have an arena deal to work with. I can't make my business work here anymore. who are you to tell me to move it? You know what? Ballmer made every owner $1 billion richer by paying $2 billion for the Clippers, and you better bet he can do whatever he wants with that team if he wants to move him. Now, I think he'll keep him in LA, but he also has 2 football teams to compete with now. He's third in line on the Staples Center. He's not going to stay at Staples Center. So, and I also wouldn't feel bad at all about taking the Clippers, to be honest, because they already have a team that in LA, and, you know, why not turn them into the Sonics? They don't have a rich history. They never win.
So you're thinking that if there is a chance, and maybe arguably it's certainly the odds have gotten better, that it will be not an expansion franchise, but a relocation from some other locale, ironically, perhaps a repeat in reverse of the story that you guys went through 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, we already sort of went through this with the Kings, you know, story. I mean, it was the same thing happening, and it just happened to because David Stern gave them so many opportunities, and because the right combination of having a great mayor who wasn't going to give in, and, you know, like
former NBA player, of course, to note, right?
Yeah. So anyway, it's just sort of like, you know, there's other teams that are struggling. I mean, certainly like Memphis, you know, they came from the Pacific Northwest. They used to be, you know, up in Vancouver, and now they're down in Memphis, and there's some issues there. There's some issues with the New Orleans situation, but, you know, those are teams that, you know, I don't know. I mean, once again, if of any NBA teams that would move, well, the Grizzlies got stolen from Vancouver. Now Seattle and Vancouver don't have teams. Like, I'd feel less bad. The Grizzlies haven't won and established this huge culture down there. I'm sure people love Grizzlies games down there and stuff, but ultimately they're a team from the Northwest, and we have one team up here instead of 3 now. So, I mean, you can justify these things how you want, no matter what. Fans are going to get hurt. But you know what? We've been hurt staying here for 11 years without a team, and we're kind of just getting sick and tired of it. We've had to fight political battle after political battle locally, and we finally have an arena ready. And so now the pressure's less on us, and the pressure's more on the league or the owners that would move here. You know, the arena thing was a huge question mark for so long, and now there's a place to play. So I don't know. I mean, I think the Clippers thing, you know, it's not being reported on, but if you really follow this arena stuff and you look at Ballmer's comments and what he's trying to do with Inglewood and how he doesn't want to be at Staples anymore. And then the most recent thing with the Lakers kind of bad-mouthing him in the media last week. I mean, it's just he's not a guy who's going to take a lot of crap from people. If he can't get his way down there, I think you'd have no problem being the biggest. I mean, he'd become the biggest hero in the history of Seattle sports, you know.
Very interesting. And so it's a very interesting dynamic now that Seattle actually has a lever, that is the stadium situation essentially covered, right? Which is not a place where this team was years ago, right? Where the stadium was the problem. It was an issue. It didn't get solved. It continued not to get solved. And now that problem seems to has dissipated. And now almost it becomes more of a green light for at least a negotiation lever for Seattle to house an NBA team again. Very interesting.
Yeah, it's not real until you have an arena deal. I mean, that's what David Stern, you know, when Ballmer and those guys came forward with their $300 million plan, and then it got the last $75 million in funding got shut down by the Washington State Legislature. You're like, you're telling me there's a deal? I don't see a deal. Where's the deal? Yeah, you had $225 million of a $300 million deal. It doesn't mean you have a $300 million deal. So no deal. What's there to talk about? And that's how it's basically been for the last decade with Seattle. And now we actually, hey, we got a deal. There's construction equipment there, and they're digging. You know, they're doing it. So, I mean, that's a much stronger position to be coming from.
All right, last question. I promise this will be. So, give me a sense then. So, where does the Sonics stuff? I know the records, if I'm not mistaken, are officially part of the Oklahoma City Thunder.
Sensitive subject.
Okay. So, all right. So, but my understanding is that the rest of it, though, still, that is the banners and the logos and all that other stuff stayed, if quote unquote, with Seattle and or could be brought into a new Sonics franchise if there ever was one. Is that right?
So the settlement agreement basically said that we would have a shared history between the two franchises. It would not very clearly defined if we are able to get an arena deal done within a certain amount of years. When that didn't happen, all the records and everything, essentially Clay Bennett bought them. He bought the 1979 championship. Those are attributed anytime on ESPN. Russell Westbrook just beat the all-time franchise scoring leader, knocking off Gary Payton. Now we did keep the name and the colors, the Seattle SuperSonics. So if a team ever comes back, they can be rebranded as the Seattle SuperSonics. I guess the other component of this is the banners themselves. Are basically the trophy and the banners are owned by Clay Bennett and their company. Right now, they are currently stored at the Washington State Museum of History and Industry here in Seattle, but they aren't on display. Actually, I think maybe the trophy's on display, but the banners and stuff are just in a box that are, they aren't up at Key Arena, for instance. Hopefully, maybe, because Clay Bennett needs to approve or deny the usage of those things. Clay Bennett can also take those at any time. He can display them. He can make replicas. He can, part of the sale of the franchise includes the league, championships and records and everything. That's part of the value of the team is that history. And so it was included in that deal. Now I'm hopeful if we get a team, particularly if we get an expansion team, that makes it much easier, because then you could just say, okay, here's all the Seattle records. We're going to extract those from the Oklahoma City records. Those are the Seattle records. These are the Oklahoma City records. I don't know if they would do that, but that's what all the fans would want, probably including Oklahoma fans. And I think that would probably be available for a price. I bet you Bennett would sell that for a couple $1,000,000 or something. I don't know. And I'd like to think we could get our trophy and banners and retired jerseys and all that stuff back too.
That's just ridiculous. I mean, just, put yourself in as you have, right, in the position of a fan, right? It's ridiculous, right? Where, you may have been part of championship teams or the banners and the history. And in many respects, you can't even go sort of revel in it or see a piece of history, without, I don't know, being escorted into a back room somewhere to.
Well, they won't even do that. We requested to shoot with some of the banners and stuff back for a music video we were doing with a local group called the Blue Scholars. This is many years ago, and we had to go through the Professional Basketball Club LLC, the Oklahoma owners, and they denied us access to shoot with the materials for this music video. We wanted to shoot with the championship banners, so they offered some replica banner of the 04-05 Northwest Division Championship or something ridiculous. It was no, we want to shoot with the 79 stuff. Come on.
Well, it seems to me, too, that the folks in Oklahoma City have gone to great lengths to, I don't want to call it whitewash, but come up with their own sort of alternate version of history. And I don't think they've taken too well, frankly, to the success and the visibility that this Sonicsgate film that you guys have put together has gotten over the years.
No, they don't like that. They would have preferred this happening that night, and maybe 20 years ago they would have been able to more easily get away with it. But we happen to just be at the right place in the right time with the right equipment and with the right sort of knowledge and interest in the topic to really dive into this. And we really wanted to expose these people. We felt like they, pretty much everyone top to bottom, from our local leaders to these out-of-town people, screwed us, the fans, over, who should be the last people that should be getting screwed over, the loyal fans who have supported this franchise and supported this team and supported this city, and to have a guy, a two-faced guy like Howard Schultz, come in and claim our city sort of as his own and sell us out in the way he did, and then to have the audacity to expect everyone to continue to bow down for him is just appalling. And then to have the audacity to run for president, and then to have the audacity to run for president as an independent when Donald Trump's running is just, man, he's really asking for something.
All right, let's promote this. So tell our audience where they can find Sonicsgate, both in, I guess it's a edited and unedited or directed versions.
So the director's cut's just for free on YouTube. It's not You can find it. Just Google it. You have a Sonicsgate YouTube page. It's slightly hidden, but not really. And then you can follow us on Twitter. Is probably the best place to like keep up on information and stuff. It's at Sonicsgate. Sonicsgate.com has links to places you can get it. You can like rent the sort of edited version. So the online director's cut is 2 hours, and I would say the sort of television version, which is about 45 minutes, that one's like a tighter edit. If you just really want to understand the story and stuff, it has like slicker graphics and stuff. That's what was aired on CNBC and ESPN. That's available on Amazon Prime for free if you have a Prime membership, 99 cents on iTunes. You can search out the YouTube version that's just like, a lot longer and has more details and interview clips and stuff like that. So yeah, those are the main things for Sonicsgate.
And are you contemplating maybe updating it and adding some more new wrinkles to this story? Because it seems to me like there is some stuff that could be added and maybe some further chapters in the story to come.
I mean, there's absolutely chapters between the local political fight and also the whole Sacramento Kings saga and other things that have happened along the way and things to still come because the story is not yet written. So, yeah, I mean, we would absolutely consider it if, we would need some sort of budget because it would take a lot of work to be able to do that. This original one was done on a shoestring, but it's just tough. There's a lot of work that would need to be done to tell this whole story and a lot of interviews and things. And I think that we always say we're waiting for the happy ending, and then we can see the full arc of the story. And that's when we might spend more time. But yeah, if there's anyone listening who wants to fund this documentary, we're looking.
All right, I'm going to leave it to all of you to determine who you think is the biggest villain in this story. Is it Clay Bennett? Is it Howard Schultz? Is it maybe even former Commissioner David Stern himself? It seems like there's no shortage of people who deserve the ire, I guess, of Seattle Sonics fans. And look, this is clearly a story that will continue. The arrival of the NHL and the reconstruction of the former, or I guess still current, Key Arena is certainly part of it. You heard there at the end, Seattle is a very interesting new lever for just about any NBA team that might be flirting with their own move. And perhaps, if you can believe it, maybe a return of the NBA at some point, perhaps with the Sonics name, to Seattle. And it's certainly a story that we will keep an eye on, especially as Mr. Schultz gets ready to, it looks like, run for president as a third-party independent candidate. And I'm sure this story will dog him in his pursuit of that. So it's a very interesting recalibration, I guess, of this Sonics saga. And again, if you haven't seen the movie, it's called Sonicsgate. And you can find the sort of, director's cut, the sort of unedited version, 2+ hours long. You'll find it on YouTube somewhere. Just search it up on YouTube and you'll find it. But the more, I believe, appreciated way to watch it in the highest quality form you can is to click off of our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode with Jason Reid and Adam Brown and just click through there and go to Amazon Prime. And you will be able to rent it or buy it in high definition form through that link. And you can, of course, project that or do whatever you want to a big screen and watch it sort of in the highest quality form. It's called Sonicsgate. And it is not the only movie that these guys have put together. Messrs. Reid and Brown are the team, among the team at 2R Productions. That's the number 2, the letter R, P-R-O-D, 2rprod.com. 2R Productions. They've done a bunch of great stuff. They're doing a movie right now called Dirtbag, which is basically focused on the legacy of a guy named Fred Beckey, who was a pioneering American mountaineer, which is just a fun and very dramatic story. Well worth seeing and watching. if you can do both at the same time, which I think you can. They've got a movie coming out called The Kicker, which I think is probably going to make its rounds around the ESPN Films kind of thing. We shall see, but it's devoted to, obviously, the most maligned and misunderstood position in all of NFL football, or college football for that matter, and that's the kicker. It's called The Kicker, and it's obviously focused on that. There's a whole bunch of other things. Again, 2rprod.com, 2R Productions. Check them out. There's a bunch of other things that you may have seen or will love to see that these guys produce out of Seattle. And again, we thank Adam and Jason so much for their time, and we wish them well, and all of you fans out in Seattle well, for your hopefully continued pursuit, and maybe successful one at that, about getting another NBA franchise, maybe a reconstituted Sonics. I want to thank, of course, all of you for listening, and I want to thank, of course, our friend Jerry Payne at Podfly Productions. He is the glue for this show. He puts of all pieces together. He finds the highest quality heavy-duty glue to put all of our pieces together and keep them sticking through all the files that we send out there in internet land. And we thank him and Podfly Productions for all of their help. You can find out more about them and him at podfly.net. All right. If you want to find out more about our show, just go to their website. Well, that's where all our social stuff is. That's goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll find our email stuff there. You'll find our social stuff there. Just go regale in all of the old episodes. And if you like what you see, just tweet or social media eyes, or send us email, or go to any place where you podcast and rate and review us. We thank you for all that love. Keep it coming. And until next week, if you can believe it, we're going to be back with yet another fun-filled episode. I appreciate to no ends you're listening. Take care, and we'll talk to you then.
So welcome to the game, ladies and gentlemen, shout the name. Seattle SuperSonics, our basketball bionic. And Gary Payton was on, bounce pass on court to Sean, and the crowd sang along. SuperSonics, oh yeah. SuperSonics,
Not just the regular team. Take McMillan with it. Deep three over Shrimp. In the corner, Gary wide open. He delivers. Yes! Gary Payton hits the three. Ay, caramba!
15 seconds to play. Deadlift with the baseline J. Up court basket break invaders. The slam dunk terminators. Fans can rattle the roof. Nothing but net, big smooth. 5 guys in a group. SuperSonics, oh yeah. SuperSonics,
Not just the regular team. Get up, Reid, man, and think it's good. Golly, is that kid strong? Oh, it's getting weird in here. Oh, Wally Baba. Nobody do the voodoo like you do.
SuperSonics, oh yeah.
Louder.
SuperSonics, oh yeah.
Louder still.
SuperSonics, oh yeah.
Now rattle the roof.
SuperSonics, oh yeah. SuperSonics, oh yeah. SuperSonics.